Ever wonder if those online surveys you take, the quizzes, if they're actually telling us anything useful?
Yeah.
Like, especially about important stuff like leadership, stress, well-being, all that.
Yeah, no, it's a totally valid question,
Right.
especially since web-based research has just exploded in the last decade or so.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, we're talking like a tenfold increase.
Wow.
So much data.
Yeah. So much data being collected from people online. But what if, like, a bunch of that data, what if it isn't even coming from real people?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's what we're diving into today.
Okay.
All thanks to a fascinating study.
All right.
It's out of the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology by Bernerth, Guinness, and Taylor.
Okay, interesting.
And they're dealing with this, like, pretty big concern.
Mm.
False identities in online research.
Oh, wow.
So before we go any further, I think we should probably break down what false identities actually means in this context.
Yeah, definitely. Think bots, imposters, people with hidden agendas.
Oh.
Basically anyone who's participating in this research, but they're not who they claim to be, which could really skew the data.
Right. So instead of getting insights from, like, I don't know, actual employees about their leadership experiences, you might be getting responses from somebody who's trying to sabotage their boss
Totally.
or a competitor just messing with company data.
Oh, yeah. It's a disturbing thought.
Yeah.
And this study highlights just how easily this could be happening.
Yeah.
You know, those traditional data quality checks, things like attention checks, time tracking,
Right.
they really focus on how someone is taking a survey,
Okay.
not who they are.
So somebody could pass all those checks, like, perfectly,
Yeah.
but still be feeding you bogus information based on, like, a made-up persona.
Precisely. And the study authors actually give some pretty shocking examples of just how prevalent this might be.
Yeah, like that one study, over 50% of the participants
Wow.
suspected of having false identities.
Oh, that's a staggering number.
That's huge.
It is. And then there's the example of how drastically demographic data can shift
Okay.
when they introduce these screening questions.
Right.
So they found that including a question about sexual orientation
Interesting.
led to a massive jump in the percentage of people identifying as LGBTQ plus A from 3.8% to 45.3%.
Wow. Okay. That makes you wonder how many people are maybe misrepresenting themselves for whatever reason.
Exactly. And perhaps the most alarming example is the study where researchers actually asked participants to verify their qualifications
Okay.
by submitting, like, a screenshot.
Oh,
And
wow.
out of 900 participants, only 33 remained.
Whoa. So almost everyone just bailed as soon as they had to prove they were legit.
It's pretty telling.
Okay. So it seems pretty clear that false identities are a problem. But what can we do about it? Like, is there any way to actually tell if someone's being truthful online?
Well, that's where this deep dive gets really interesting. The researchers are suggesting using something we all have,
Okay.
IP addresses.
IP addresses. Okay. How can those help us figure out who's real and who's faking it?
Well, think of an IP address as like a digital fingerprint
Okay.
for a device that's connected to the internet.
Right.
And just like fingerprints, IP addresses can actually reveal a lot about, their owner.
Okay, so we're not just talking about tracking location. There's more to it than that.
Right. The researchers propose using two specific pieces of information from IP addresses. First, there's the IP threat score,
IP threat score.
which is basically like a danger rating.
Ooh, IP threat score. That sounds kind of ominous.
It is a bit like a danger rating, yeah.
Yeah.
It's based on the past activity associated with a particular IP address, whether it's been linked to things like spamming or hacking.
So if an IP address has, like, a history of shady behavior,
Yeah,
it gets flagged with a high threat score.
exactly.
Okay.
The scores range from 0 to 1, 0 being the safest and 1 being, well, a pretty big red flag.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
So what's the second piece of information they look at?
The Internet Service Provider, or ISP, this helps differentiate between consumer-focused ISPs,
Right.
the ones most people use at home, like Comcast or Verizon, and then you have proxy-based ISPs, which are often used to mask someone's identity or location.
So by combining the IP threat score and the ISP, researchers can get a much clearer picture of who might be behind those survey responses.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's a two-pronged approach to identifying potentially problematic respondents.
All right, so they've got this new method for sniffing out these fake identities. But does it actually work? What did they find when they put it to the test?
Well, they classified participants into two groups. targeted and non-targeted.
Okay, so targeted being those with like low threat scores and consumer ISPs, so essentially like the likely real people. And non-targeted being those with high threat scores, the proxy ISPs, the ones who might be trying to hide something.
You got it. And when they compared the data from these two groups, some fascinating differences emerged.
Lay it on me. What kind of differences are we talking about?
Well, first off, the targeted participants were far more reliable. They missed fewer attention checks, and they were more likely to answer open-ended questions, the ones that require more thought and effort.
That makes sense, right? If you're genuinely interested in the topic and you're being honest, you're more likely to engage fully with the survey.
Exactly. On the flip side, the non-targeted participants were less likely to put in that extra effort.
So we're already seeing signs that that non-targeted group might not be as invested in providing accurate data. But did their inclusion actually affect the study's overall findings?
It did in some pretty significant ways. They found noticeable differences in the average scores across various constructs, like job satisfaction, stress levels, things like that.
So depending on who was included in the data, the picture of workplace well-being could look totally different.
Precisely. And here's where it gets even more interesting. They found that even the underlying factor structure of some of the measures changed.
Hold on, factor structure. For those of us who aren't, research whizzes, could you break that down a bit?
Yeah, sure. Think of it as like the basic building blocks of a concept.
Okay.
So like if we're measuring leadership,
Right.
there might be different underlying factors that contribute to it, like communication skills, decision-making ability, and so on.
Okay, got it. So you're saying that depending on whether that non-targeted group was included, the way we understand leadership itself could actually change.
That's the implication. It suggests that if our data is tainted, even our fundamental understanding of concepts like leadership or well-being could be flawed.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, we're not just talking about getting a few survey responses wrong here. This could impact how we design leadership training programs, make organizational decisions, even give feedback to leaders.
And that's why this research is so important. It's a wake-up call for anyone who's involved in web-based research,
Right.
whether you're taking surveys, conducting studies, or applying those findings in the real world.
So what does all of this mean for our listeners? Why should they care about false identities in online research?
Let's connect this to the bigger picture. Imagine you're a leader and you're going through a leadership training program that's based on faulty data. Or, if you're an HR professional, imagine making decisions about employee well-being based on inaccurate information.
Or even on a personal level, right? Like, think about those 360 feedback surveys people get at work. What if that feedback is being manipulated by someone with a hidden agenda?
It raises some important questions about the validity of a lot of the data that we're using to make decisions. It really makes you wonder how much of what we think we know is actually based on solid ground.
Right. And it's not just about, leadership surveys or employee feedback. Think about all those health and well-being studies we see online.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people are making decisions about their lifestyle, their diet, even their medical treatments based on information that could be completely compromised.
Exactly. And the scariest part is, it's so hard to tell what's real and what's not. These false identities could be lurking anywhere.
It's like a game of whack-a-mole. You try to address one issue and another one pops up. But I do think this IP address analysis that the researchers are proposing is a really interesting approach.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a promising tool. But I'm curious, how do they actually use it? Like, do they have to get special permission to access people's IP addresses?
Well, that's the thing. It's actually easier than you might think to get at least some of this information.
Really?
Yeah, for example, a lot of online survey platforms already collect IP addresses as part of their standard data collection process.
Oh, wow. So the data's already there. It's just a matter of using it in a more sophisticated way.
Exactly. And they don't even need the full IP address to do this analysis. They can actually work with a masked or anonymized version to protect people's privacy.
Okay, that makes sense. So they've got the IP addresses, they're looking at the threat scores, the ISPs, but how do they actually decide who gets flagged as a potential false identity?
Well, they've developed some algorithms and criteria based on patterns they've observed in the data. For instance, if someone's IP address has a high threat score and they're using a proxy server known for masking identities, that's a big red flag.
Okay, but what if someone's just using a VPN for legitimate privacy reasons? Would they get flagged too?
That's where it gets tricky. And that's why they emphasize that this isn't about catching every single false identity.
Right.
It's about identifying those who are most likely to be misrepresenting themselves and potentially skewing the data.
So it's more of a screening tool than a definitive test.
Exactly. And it's not a replacement for other data quality checks, like attention checks and time tracking.
Right. It's about adding another layer of protection.
Precisely. And I think what's really exciting about this approach is that it's not just about catching the bad guys.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, by identifying these potential false identities, researchers can actually start to understand the motivations behind them.
That's interesting. Like, why are people creating these fake personas in the first place?
Exactly. Are they bored? Are they trying to game the system? Are they being paid to do it?
Or maybe they just don't want to reveal their true identities for privacy reasons.
Right. There could be a whole range of reasons. And by understanding those motivations, we can start to develop more effective strategies for addressing the issue.
It's almost like we're doing a deep dive into the deep dive,
Yes,
right?
correct.
Trying to understand the people behind the data, not just the data itself.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this research so fascinating. It's forcing us to really examine our assumptions about online data and how we use it.
So let me ask you this.
Mhm.
What do you think the long-term implications of this research might be? Like, if we start using IP address analysis more widely, how could it change the landscape of online research?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, it could lead to much more reliable data,
Okay.
which in turn could lead to better decisions.
Yeah, makes sense.
You know, everything from how we develop products and services
Yeah.
to how we design policies.
Right.
But it could also raise some really important ethical questions
Okay, like what?
about privacy and data security. You know, how much information should researchers be able to collect about participants? And how can we ensure that data is being used responsibly and ethically?
Yeah, those are big questions for sure. I mean, it seems like we're just scratching the surface of this whole issue of false identities online. And as technology continues to evolve, I imagine it's only going to get more complex. Like, what about all those deepfakes we're seeing now? Could we reach a point where it's virtually impossible to distinguish between a real person and a fabricated one?
It's certainly possible, and I think that's why it's so important to have these conversations now, to raise awareness about the potential risks and to start thinking about solutions. We need to develop new tools and technologies for verifying identities online, and we need to have clear guidelines and regulations in place to protect people's privacy.
Well said. I think the key takeaway here is that we can't just take online data at face value. We need to be critical thinkers, question our assumptions, look for ways to verify information before we accept it as truth. And I think that's a good rule of thumb for just about everything we encounter online, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's more important now than ever to be discerning consumers of information. So the next time you see a survey, a quiz, or even just a news article online,
Yeah.
take a moment to consider the source. Think about who might be behind it and what their motivations might be. Don't just blindly accept everything you see.
Words to live by. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. Could the rise of remote work and VPN usage actually make the problem of false identities even worse? It's something to think about as we navigate this increasingly complex digital world. Until next time, keep those minds sharp, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.